certainly an opportunity just to be a bit conversational about it. So if there's anything that people have gone home and tried over the last couple of weeks to couple of months, certainly open to that. I've added a few new things in, so don't be worried, it isn't just a repeat, but I do acknowledge a lot of you have seen it. So we'll wriggle on, but please interrupt if there's anything that you'd like to go into in a bit more detail. What I was going to do is just have a look at why and when we containment feed. Now that obviously feels a little bit obvious or outdated at the moment, but a bit on preparing for feeding, what facilities and equipment, and the practicalities of it. And I've developed a bit of a decision tree that'll hopefully help people decide what setup they need. And one of the key take-homes I find, particularly with cattle, is there's this mental block for people where they see some of the really good facilities that have been set up that have got a lot of concrete and steel in them, and they feel that that's a bit of an insurmountable task. So most of our good containment areas with cattle, particularly at a commercial level or for breeders, are effectively hot wire systems. So I've got plenty of photos and footage, and we've got the ability to go and visit one after we've had a look around here at Waroona, just as a contrast. But that's one of the key points. We'll do a little bit on livestock nutrition. I have given you all a handout, and if you haven't got one, there's one on the table. It's two sides. One side's just a little bit on nutrition. I apologise to the sheep guys, it is focused on cattle, but I have got some points in here on containment area design for the sheep. And on the back is sort of containment dimensions and trough space recommendations. So, and then a quick bit on animal health. Being a vet, I can't avoid mentioning some of that. Righto, so I suppose what is containment feeding of livestock? The way I've best been able to define it is as a strategy for competent management of droughts. And I think the word droughts is probably inappropriate here as well. So there's times, particularly between when we finish consuming that summer feed prior to the autumn break on an annual basis, that there's going to be some application of the ability to contain stock to protect the pastures and increase that growth potential in often what is a short growing opportunity. So we'll go through that a little bit more, but I think I'm going to remove droughts moving forward. I really think this is just an opportunity to promote, A, provide animals the requirements they need, B, protect the pastures, but B, actually promote what growth rates we can get in that short time. It has a range of different names: confinement feeding, containment feeding, drought lots, feed lots. What we're talking about is the containment or locking animals up for the purpose of feeding them and protecting paddocks. So I think there's 5 key objectives. The first is certainly to rest pastures once we reach some trigger points. Those trigger points are around ground cover. We'll have animal-based trigger points as well as pasture-based trigger points. Lockie's very right in suggesting that sheep, I think the reason that sheep producers probably are more open or have a longer history with containment feeding is twofold. One, they're easier to feed on account of most of the requirement can be provided as grain. We need a very low level of roughage to keep them going. It's a little bit different in cattle. They're more subject to acidosis and bloat issues. The second is that sheep are much more damaging to pasture if left out there to continue to mine away at dry matter. So I think that's what's driven that. But key objective is our ability to provide the livestock with nutrition as cost effectively as possible. We want to optimise our labour responsibility. So there are a lot of scenarios where, as compared to sacrifice paddocks where stock are often being fed daily or whatever, we've got a lot of scenarios where they're only feeding cattle 3 times a week, which has really improved people's enthusiasm to do it. We're trying to promote pasture response in that short growing opportunity following the autumn break, and nice to have a bit of a sprinkle on us this morning and as we're speaking, but we certainly need a bit more. And so I suppose what we're trying to do is achieve good outcomes for pastures, livestock, the staff and the business without being tied to it at the hip. And one thing that's coming up in a lot of conversations now, you know, we've been around a lot of the clients and set up some fodder budgets, but we're now getting to the point where in a lot of those cases we basically budgeted on getting ourselves to early to mid-June. That was kind of the point we decided, let's peg for that. We're now all considering what our options are if it goes beyond that. It's been quite a long feeding period, and so that's part of it. And one thing I think is important is to get a little bit of differentiation between the managers of the business and the operators of the business. Now, that's not so easy in family operations because everybody shares that, but certainly in some of the scaled businesses, it's really important for the decision makers to get some headspace, make decisions and be enthusiastic about it. The staff don't carry the same level of financial responsibility. They're very happy to do the work, but I think it's important they understand there's a plan. So that's a key one. Why would we feed in containment? We've got to consider, are we feeding, it allows us to feed a maintenance ration or potentially short-term production. As we said, allows us to provide the ration whilst we rest the pastures. Big point is the confinement reduces energy requirements by 8 to 15%. So in most of the numbers I'll throw at you, we've used 10% for easy maths. But I think that's a key point where, yes, cattle are easier on pastures, but we can still, if we're feeding for 6 months, a 10% energy saving becomes reasonably significant. Certainly more labour efficient to feed them rather than spread out across paddocks. Maintains ground cover, minimises erosion. Obviously some advantages from the point of view of water infiltration. We certainly improve our speed of recovery, and today I'll just focus quickly on the growth potential with and without stock on those paddocks. So it's important to understand if we get an autumn break event, we've got short green pasture, the amount of that pasture that animals can eat is huge, which is really reducing its growth potential. And too often we look at growth charts without remembering a lot of those growth charts are actually based on pasture in cages. So the growth potential of that plant is increasing with leaf area. If we're grazing these pastures and keeping the leaf area right down, its growth potential is much lower. So key point for me. Allows us to manage weed introduction because we're doing it all into one spot, so a bit of biosecurity advantage. And certainly if we have to get stock out, it's handy having them near facilities. So trigger factors, I don't think we'll talk too much about that. It's obvious that we're at a point now where our dry matter is pretty low on average. I don't think I've seen it this low. And often there's a bit of a threshold for ground cover of 70%. A lot of our clients would have a higher target than that. But given, it's probably my opinion that the difficulty this year is not so much the delayed autumn break, it's more the failed spring and the fact that we ended up with so little dry matter, and we really started to desiccate these paddocks probably mid-December. Certainly by New Year's, we had almost no ground cover and we were drying out. So it's as dry as I've seen it, even though there's been times where stock and paddock condition has been worse. I don't think we've seen it this dry. Site selection, really important to plan. Some similar messages here with the water planning. We want to utilise existing infrastructure, but in particular, the water's often the big one. So we can move fodder storage wherever we need to go, but getting fodder to the animals and having that at the water system and using existing yards, laneways and roads is really important. Certainly can use annual pasture paddocks as a sacrifice lot for feeding, and that would be a preference over our perennials. When it comes to feeding, I'll do a quick bit on feeding. Obviously we have to have a feed analysis so we know what it is we're doing. And the only thing worse than feeding livestock is feeding them and not getting an outcome. So the only way we can be confident on that is doing a fodder budget, which does rely on us having accurate numbers. And that, that can absolutely be done on farm, but when we're testing, grain's a lot easier to test than hay and silage, for instance. When we're testing hay and silage, really important to try and get multiple samples using a core tool so that we're getting a cross-section of the bale from multiple bales so that we're not jeopardising the accuracy of that result. Obviously important to understand requirements of different groups of livestock. We've got some requirements around roughage when we're managing the rumen. I'll talk quickly on that. And then we need to have a fodder source and a plan that actually matches the objectives. Too often I see animals locked up and being fed, and we probably haven't allocated the right feed to the right group, and by the time we figure out where we're going, we've consumed too much of it. So, you really need a plan, and part of that plan is identifying how much of a fodder type you've got and how long it's going to last. So, the numbers are not terribly complex, but this is where the managers need to be able to sit down, get some headspace and crunch the numbers. And you've got to know what the objective is, which I've set up this decision tree to try and help. Bit on basic nutrition. I don't think we need to go through it too much, but obviously we've got the dry matter component, so that's the weight of feed once we remove the water, and that's really key. So understanding that with the cost of freight where it is, there's no way we can be freighting silage around. Silage is often going to be 50 to 60% dry matter in baled silage, so identifying things that are high dry matter makes the freight component quite efficient. What animals are eating is the dry matter. So whenever we're looking at test results, it's per kilogram of dry matter. Obviously, when we go to do the feed out, we then convert that back to an as-fed quantity. But everything, what they're eating, the water is automatically absorbed as water. What they're eating is the dry matter component. Energy is the key thing we're trying to buy. And when we talk about cost effectiveness, that's what we're trying to identify. It's the primary reason we're buying it. We need to be cognizant of protein. So it's the crude protein in the diet, because different groups of livestock have got different requirements. And this is often the limitation. It's normally reasonably easy to identify energy, but in the case of growing stock, it's hard to find cost-effective protein sources. So if you have something on farm that has adequate protein, really important to keep that away from more mature groups of livestock that don't need it. NDF, really key. I've got a quick slide, we'll look at that on its own, but NDF is the neutral detergent fibre, and it dictates the quantity of that feed an animal can eat. So you could have a really appropriate energy level, but if the fibre level's too high, they can't eat enough to derive that energy, it's not going to work. So key that we understand that. And then a bit on roughage. So ruminants do require roughage for rumen function. The microbes need it to be able to break down the cellulose and other components of the cell wall in plant material. Sheep, we can get away with 10%. Cattle need closer to 30% roughage on a dry matter basis through the week. So if you're talking about a 70 kilo ewe on a maintenance ration eating 2% of her body weight and 10%, it comes out at about 1 kilo of roughage per week. So sheep, we can get away with very low levels of roughage. Cattle, as I said, 3 times that. So we need a lot more roughage, and they're more, the risk of acidosis is much higher. So we've got to transition them onto these diets a lot slower to get there. But at the end of the day, what we're buying is energy, and so we need to be fully cognizant of the cost per megajoule of metabolisable energy. And often when we're doing our budgets on cows, we're feeding for maintenance. So obviously we often look at a cost per day to maintain them. As we're weaners, we'll have a look at the cost per kilo of live weight gained. And obviously the faster they gain weight, the more we're diluting that cost. Some basic rules of thumb: confinement saves us 10%. Utilisation of body reserves. So 1 kilo of weight gain in an animal is 4 kilos of intake at a rough level. 1 kilo of weight loss liberates 3.2 kilos of feed. So we've actually got an 80% conversion efficiency, which is a bucket load better than what happens when we feed silage out to stock. So using body reserves is really key. And I've also got a slide coming up on body condition where it's important to understand that in the case of cows, recommendations are often 2.5 score as a spring calving cow at the point of calving. If we're confident of spring feed in front of that animal post calving, we can calve them at a minimum of 2 score. And so therefore any weight we leave on that animal over that condition score is very expensive and not very efficient. So we should utilise their body reserves, but do it slowly over the period to reduce how much we've got to tip in. So if we feed these cows for 6 months, ewes are the same. If we feed these breeders for a 6-month period, and at the end of that they've got an excess of body condition, then we paid for that at the highest feed cost in that period. So it's important that we utilise that as a resource. And we've been through those other bits. So NDF, when people are buying hay, grain's obviously not often limiting. Grain will be anywhere from 25 to 35 NDF. But the rule is 120 is a fixed number, divided by the NDF gives us the percentage of their body weight they can eat on a daily basis. And that underpins everything when it comes to trying to do our fodder budget. So typically, if you go and buy a cereal hay, it's going to be somewhere between 50 and 60% NDF. So 120 divided by 50 is going to give you 2.5. They'll eat 2.5% of their body weight. Your higher protein hays or silages are often at the 40 level. So 120 divided by 40 gives you 3%. So we're going to get a production ration out of that. We're going to struggle to get a production ration out of a cereal hay. And in the case of our straws and things where we're feeding breeders on maintenance, they're often more like 60 to 75. So we're pushing down into this maintenance or sub-maintenance category. But as a very basic rule of thumb, 1% intake of their body weight is for survival, 2% intake for maintenance and 3% for production. So we've got to decide based on the group of livestock, what's our objective. If it's breeders and we want to maintain them, then we're working on approximately 2% intake. Weaners, if we're wanting them to produce, it's more than that. Now we can do more accurate numbers, but that's some rules of thumb. I'll skip over this, it's in your sheets. I just was trying to give you some broad numbers or indications of what feed requirements. I suppose the key point is just to identify that a 200 kilo weaner gaining 0.6 of a kilo a day has a requirement of 58 megs, is actually basically the same as a 500 kilo dry cow on maintenance. So the cost of gain, the amount of energy it takes to gain weight, is quite high, quite expensive. The difference is the protein. So the dry cow will get away with a 7 to 10% protein intake, is where a 200 kilo weaner is going to need closer to 16%. So you can start to appreciate it's really important that we identify what the groups are and what our feedstuffs are and try and allocate them appropriately. But in containment, they'll actually eat the same amount of energy, these two animals, on different jobs. Body condition score. In the case of cattle, we're weaning when cows reach 2.5. And the reason for this is it's quite easy to maintain them in that body condition through to calving. And remember, if we've actually weaned them in 4 score and we want to maintain them, they've actually got more weight and it's going to be expensive to maintain that weight, which is just very much pointless because they can do everything they need to do from a 2.5. Now, in a lot of cases, people will be prepared to go down to 2 score. We do reduce preg rate potential a little bit, however, not significantly, which means if that's an energy saving through that feeding period, it should be considered. Yeah, sorry, yep.
Is that similar for sheep?
Yeah, so there's some body condition score targets. The problem with, I'd have to pull out a table for you. The problem with sheep is obviously that we're not often breeding them. Like the advantage of cattle, we rebreed them when they're lactating, but we're doing so on spring flusher feed. So sheep, we need to maintain some body condition there to facilitate breeding them out of season or out of the pasture growth season. But I can definitely get I don't do a lot of sheep stuff, it's not fresh in the mind, but I can definitely get a table with the recommendations on that for you. I mean, the key difference is that in the case of beef, we're often lactating, so the need to flush them is huge. Hence why autumn programs are often so hard to get good outcomes out of. As where in the case of sheep, they're often not lactating. So as long as we meet those targets, they should be able to perform. A little bit on weaners, don't focus too hard on that. I suppose I was just trying to highlight that when we're doing really early weaners, so sub 140 kilos, they've got a high requirement for protein, so they're probably needing 18% protein. And typically, if we were doing a grain to hay ration, they'd need close to a 50-50 to get the adequate amount of energy. They need close to 12 megs of energy per kilo because of how small they are. As they get bigger, if we look at a 220 to 280, the proteins come down, so is the energy concentration. And I've got the next slide will explain why. So what we've got to understand is that an animal is limited to how much they can eat by the fibre content of the feed. And as the animal gets bigger, the percentage of their rumen space that is required for maintenance becomes smaller, i.e. the amount that is able to be allocated to production becomes bigger. So what we've got here is just 2 stylised rumens. On the right, we've got a 200 kilo weaner. On the left, we've got a 580 kilo cow. Now they're on exactly the same energy density feed for the purpose of the argument, but what we can see is that the maintenance requirement of that 200 kilo animal is 34 megajoules of energy, which happens to be 60% of what it can eat on that feed. When we look at the cow, she's got a higher maintenance requirement of 67 megs, but as a percentage, it's down to 40%. So she's actually able to allocate more of her rumen space to production, which means she'll gain weight faster. Does that make sense to people? I mean, that's why feeding these young calves and lambs is so hard, because we need such a high energy density to pack it in, because their ability to eat relative to their maintenance requirement is lower. Tipping point's about 180 kilos, so in the case of beef calves. So over 180 it all becomes a fair bit easier, and we're often feeding a restricted ration in the case of our heifers just to gain somewhere between 0.4 and 0.7, often aiming for half a kilo, so that we're poking them along. If we feed them for more of a gain, it becomes expensive. And really the lowest cost of gain we're going to have is on pasture, We're just trying to make sure that we don't reduce this animal's performance for growth later in life. And so we're trying to keep them healthy so that the minute we've got that pasture, we can let them out and they go well. I suppose in the case of steers and bulls, should we ad lib feed them to get maximal performance, given we're feeding to an endpoint? Often we still, depending on the length of the feed, we'll still peg them at that 0.5 to 0.7. One conversation I've been having lately, particularly with steers that are in containment areas on a total mixed ration, they're actually, with the way the forecast is, and roughage is becoming our limiting factor. So we can continue to access grain, but roughage is definitely becoming the limiting factor. So what we're going to do in a lot of cases is actually up the concentrate of the ration that the steers are on to push them to an endpoint and then get them off the place. Now, if we were confident that the season would break and we could let them out, then we would hold off and graze pasture. If we're now at the point where we're wondering at what point between June and August is this going to occur, we could potentially have these animals turned off out of the feedlot at a known cost of production in August. So that is becoming a fairly common conversation. And what we need to also be aware is the interval between when we get reasonable rains and when we've got enough pasture to let stock out of containment is getting longer the further we go into winter. So if that happens in March or April, it's going to be much shorter than if it happens in June or July. And it's a sliding scale. So that's the frustration with the way this season's unfolding, is that period actually becomes longer the further we go. Some practicality stuff, and then we're just on to pictures. Yard weaning process, really important to educate weaners how to eat and drink in containment, and to whatever the different feeding systems are. If we're feeding grain or pellets to cattle, we need access to roughage. Obviously, there's nothing better than putting it through a mixer where we control what they eat, and they're getting what we call a total mixed ration, so they're not able to selectively eat one or the other. But if we're using self-feeders, we've got to provide roughage and we've got to make sure it's palatable enough to actually want to eat it. So one of the issues we have with pellet self-feeder systems, they're great because they're efficient, i.e. you can fill them up once a week. The negative is we get some animals that eat nothing but pellets and some animals that eat nothing but the roughage source. And so we get a lot more inconsistency in the performance of those animals. And sometimes the animals that are eating all pellets aren't even the higher producers because they're going through episodes of gut upset. So there's no doubt that the best thing is to be able to provide it as a complete feed, but that's not always appropriate. We want to introduce or transition onto grain slowly to prevent acidosis. Does take the literature's not clear on it. Takes 3 to 6 weeks. Takes 6 weeks for a rumen to fully acclimatise to a ration. But the reality is animals are often acclimatised to eating it and starting to perform at the 3-week mark. So clearly what we don't want to be doing is having rapid changes in that diet, because we're going to continually upset them and put ourselves back. So that's why doing a fodder budget at the start is really important. We can actually decide this is what we're going to feed and then allocate it and reduce the number of times we change what they're eating. Monitor for shy feeders and pull them out. These are the animals that possibly want to be at much lower stocking density on self-feeder type setups. Key one, which still aggravates me a little bit in my travels, is drafting weaners on weight, not sex. So too often we're getting in and we're just addicted to the idea of getting the steers and the heifers separated. What we really need to do is draft them on weight. So if we have a range of weights on a ration, this is exactly why I have that slide in there with the 2 rumens. If we've got a 300 kilo weaner and a 180 kilo weaner on the same ration, that gap, everybody imagines that gap continues at the same trajectory. What's actually happening is that gap is getting bigger. So what we deliberately need to do is put these 2 animals on slightly different rations. So this animal's gaining faster than this animal is, to actually reduce that gap and make them more marketable and get a better outcome. So too often we go sex, we should be going weight, is my point there. And similarly on cows, we all seem to be addicted to having them in age groups. What we really should be having, if we're under pressure and we're trying to use that body reserve, best thing we can do is have them in body condition drafts. So we've got some heavy animals that are normally very robust and somehow live off the smell of an oily rag, and we can pressure them a lot, through to the lighter animals that are struggling. And if we leave them in the same group, the same thing happens. We get a divergence of the body condition. What we want to do is close that gap. And one of the interesting things that I learnt through the last drought with clients was we did that 1 or 2 years where we were splitting them on body condition, then boxing them back up at calving. And we actually created a situation by the 3rd year, we could no longer draft them because we'd actually closed the gap so much they were quite consistent. But when we're leaving them in these mixed groups, the heavy ones just seem to be getting heavier and the light ones seem to be getting lighter. And so we're constantly diverging. Preparing facilities. So obviously we need to be able to contain the animals, i.e. we don't want them escaping. We need access to water, which has been talked about at length. Soil type, as Lockie says, there's certain scenarios where this can be really frustrating, and often people go, yeah, but once it rains I won't be in there, but there is an overlap. So having a soil types that can support us, and often, the good thing is often this isn't where our best country is, so trying to set this up somewhere that is well drained, has a slope, and has a good soil type, you know, a granity or a much harder soil type, which will also reduce dust. So one of the issues we're having at the moment, particularly when we don't get the density right, is on some of these clay loam and sandy loam soils, we're getting a serious amount of dust. So if that can be more gravelly or more sandy, that'll often reduce dust. Shelter, is shade required? This is a tough one. I think you give them shade and they'll use it, and if you're feeding for production, shade will be important, but it's not an essential part of a drought mitigation containment area lot. Certainly cows can do very well without it. Weaners that we're trying to get performance out of might be more justified, and certainly heavy steers in the case of heat. A lot of data you'll see on shelter or shade. Got to remember these feedlot steers are very heavy, and they're wearing a jacket of what could be anywhere between 20 and 50 mils of fat, and on those hot days they'll have some real issues. That's not the case with our animals in much more moderate body conditions, so we won't get those overheating events that are often in the literature. Effluent management, vehicle access, that's where slope, you can have lots of slope, but if you get a little bit of rain, vehicle access becomes a real issue. And then you've got the consideration of pen construction, which we'll go through. Obviously you can have permanent fences with or without a hot wire, you can have electric fence only, you can have cable fencing, temporary panels, steel construction. So some quick recommendations, which are all on your sheet. We're 5 metres squared for calves at weaning. We want to keep them in tight, but if we're going to feed them post-weaning, which we are now, the recommendation is 10, and then I work on 20 for mature cattle. That's the pen space, so 20 square metres per cow. There is a recommendation here on maximum mob sizes of 250. Often I'll get debated on that. Personally, I've got some mob sizes of 400 working really well, but the animals have to be used to what your infrastructure is. Don't go and put a mob of 400 weaners in a hot wire setup and expect them to be there the next day. So you've got to understand that if they're well educated to hot wires and they're well educated to being in that mob size and you confine them, no issue. But if you go and box mobs up from hundreds straight into a 400, stick them in a feedlot yard, they'll blow it out. And there's an important balance between dust and mud, which does absolutely influence animal welfare and performance. So I've become more and more interested in the sheep facilities, trying to do the numbers. So sheep recommendations here are 2 to 5 square metres. So potentially up to 5 square metres for some of your larger bodied composite ewes, down to 2 square metres for lambs. Now, that's actually a really tight space. A lot of the containment areas I'm seeing built are being designed at a 1 hectare type block with the objective that we can re-sow it or do other things with it outside of the containment feeding scenario. And I think that's great. However, they're really, really dusty at the moment. We're starting to see some pneumonia issues. And so what we need to do there is tighten them up. Now, I'll go to the next slide. This is trough space. So big difference between, again, we've got to decide, are we feeding for restriction, i.e. less than what they can eat on a daily basis, or are we feeding for production? Now, if we're feeding for production, we'll get away with 25 to 30 centimetres, but that's because it's effectively ad lib feed. So they'll come and go, similar to a water trough, they'll come and go for their feed. If we're restriction feeding, i.e. less than what they can eat, it's really important they can all eat at the same time. Because if we put out a ration that's 40 to 60% of what they can eat, and they can't eat simultaneously, some animals are going to eat 100% of what they can eat, some animals are going to eat 10%, and we're clearly going to get some really bad outcomes. So in this case, you're dealing with 300 to 400 millimetres per head, so 3 to the metre for your growing stock, your yearlings or weaners, and then 600 millimetres for mature cows. Clearly, which comes up very shortly, clearly we can't be having fancy setups with concrete bunks when we're investing in 0.6 of a metre per cow for the trough space. So we're forced, in the case of restriction feeding, to find some cheaper ways to feed these animals. In the case of ewes, the issue I've had when I've been looking at a lot of these is that trough space recommendation for ewes is 30 centimetres, so 300 millimetres on a single side trough, or 15 on a double side. So they need 30 centimetres per head. The issue you've got then when you start talking about space, so if we've got a mob of 500 ewes, let's say they're big bodied composites, we allocate them 5 square metres each, we've got 2,500 square metres, but we want to feed without going in the pen. If we can go in the pen, it's easy because they can feed from both sides, we can loop around. Now, if you've got somebody doing the gate, that's fine. There's nothing more efficient than being able to feed without entering the pen. And I suppose in the case of cattle, it's much more important because cows will march out the gate. Ewes are probably not quite so domineering on that. So the problem is, if we've got 500 ewes, they need 30 centimetres. I don't know why I'm pointing there, it's not up there, sorry. But we need 30 centimetres for a ewe, 500 in the mob, we need 150 metres of feed space. But if we need 2,500 metres squared total, we've got a very funny shape. We're 150 metres by 17 metres deep. These are very long, narrow pens. So as I've been visiting a lot of these dusty setups and some of the pneumonia issues, I'm really battling in my mind how to get it right. So on a DSE level, sheep are actually requiring potentially 5 times the amount of trough space per DSE to cattle. So it starts becoming an issue of complexity there. Some of the best setups are where we've got paired pens. So you've got long rectangle pens in doubles with laneways between each one, and you feed on 3 sides. And so what you're trying to do, you've got a trough in the middle of your 2 pens shared either side, and then you've got 3 feeding sides and a common fence in the middle. So yeah, like lambs. I mean, we can throw lambs on a self-feeder with a bit of roughage in the corner. They're easy, as long as we can. Again, we're only filling it up potentially once a week. The problem's the ewes, which we're trying to feed on that restricted ration. Yeah, which does seem to be a common solution, is feeding not daily, because if you feed daily and there's inadequate trough space, they're going to run out. But if you feed only 2 or 3 times a week, then you're assuming they're going to all come in and all get a gut fill. Still not perfect, but it does solve part of that problem. And certainly with roughage, it's a good way to do the roughage, because otherwise you've put the roughage in the corner and you might budget on a kilo a head per week, but if it's ad lib access, they could eat God knows what, and you're not actually restricting their intake. Which makes it hard not to imagine that having an adequate trough space from the outset's not easier, in that you could still feed 2 or 3 times a week by putting that volume in there, but it just becomes expensive when you're trying to have troughs for this as opposed to feeding on the ground, which, I mean, sheep are very good at feeding on the ground, and if you can have a little bit of a gravel apron that creates some drainage away from the feed point along the fence and gets it out of the powdered dirt, then they'll be able to pick it up a lot better. But I think it's quite interesting. But the thing I was surprised at is at a DSE level, they need a lot of trough space. Righto, water trough space, we've talked about this, obviously through the day. I think it's very different in a containment area to in a paddock, which was Peter's key point. What we seem to see here is that people get away with murder, to be honest. Doesn't matter what they do, the flow rate's the key bit. If the flow rate can't keep up, they'll demolish the trough in the case of cattle. So that's where it becomes an issue. So flow rate's really essential. We sort of work on 2 to 3 hours, but no argument with the 4 hours. But you want to be able to water them. I think the big thing is actually knowing what water you've got behind you and understanding that you can, in hot, dry days, get up to 20% of body weight as a water requirement. Typically, it's more at the 10% of body weight mark. But if you've got 600 kilo cows locked up, heavily pregnant, and a really tough day comes through, they could drink 120 litres each in that day. So understanding how much water we need is pretty key. I think those maths you had were good, but certainly that's they don't have the mob behaviour in containment they have in the paddock, so you don't have that big sort of migration to the water point, but they still do a little bit. Like when you sit and observe them, when somebody decides it's time for a drink, a lot of them decide it's time for a drink, and And I've definitely seen where the flow rate's inadequate, they'll just bulldoze the trough, and that gets frustrating. So, yeah, so MLA's got some, there's a wide range. They talk 30 millimetre per head trough space. All right, 2 slides left and then a heap of photos, I promise. I think when it comes to the feeding system, and this is probably the key bit I want to talk about, is and I've set up I won't go through this too much because I've actually made a decision tree, but initially you've got to decide, am I supplementary feeding these animals in a paddock, or am I actually going to am I going to feed them a complete ration? I shouldn't say lock them up. Am I going to sup feed them or feed them a complete ration? If I'm feeding them a complete ration, then I've got to decide, am I feeding them for production, where in most cases I'm going to feed ad lib, or am I restriction feeding them to use body reserve and just meat maintenance? They're a range of the options. So I've created this little decision tree, and bear with me as we go through it. But obviously the first thing is, as I said, are we feeding complete ration or are we sup feeding? If we're going to sup feed, ultimately we're just feeding in the paddock, and at some point, if it continues, we're going to end up where that's a sacrifice feed, that's a sacrifice paddock, and we're feeding a high percentage to all of their requirement at some point in the process. And my argument is, once we get to the point that it's a sacrifice paddock, we might as well restrict them to save that 10% energy. So the cost of sacrifice paddocks is ongoing damage to the paddock and not saving the 10% energy. In the case of we're going to feed them a complete ration, we've then got to decide, are we going to restriction feed them in the case of breeding stock, or are we going to production feed them in the case of growing stock? If we're production feeding, we've got a series of options. We could have permanent containment and bunks, i.e. a feedlot, concrete bunks or similar. There's a range of options which I'll run through. Or we could feed them in containment areas, on the ground, or in temporary bunks. And the options here are many, and heaps of people have got different. I'll show you a range of what I think works, but if anybody's got something that they think works at home, throw it out. They're obviously wire setup, and I get a lot of kickback saying you can't have young stock on the hot wire like you can cows. Well, I've got some photos to debate that. We could have a permanent fence with an out-rigged hot wire. We could have the cable fencing. We could have cattle panels. We could have steel construction. Oh, and the other option is, rather than feeding on the ground, feed on belting, which I've seen some really unique systems where we've got belting along the edge of containment pens, and sometimes we've even just got belting in the middle of sacrifice paddocks with a post and hot wire driven in through the middle of it, purely to stop animals getting on the feed. Like, the reason we want to feed along the fence is, in the case of the hot wire setups, A, so we don't have to go in there, but B, so they don't get on that feed run and shit and piss all the way along it and foul it up. So, you know, sometimes these pellet systems where we're using roughage in the paddock, or the paddock for roughage, and we're delivering them pellets, having a hot wire on belting with just 2 endpoints that are maxis just stops the stock running along it. You'll find they feed from both sides. So that works. We've got our pellet and hay self-feeder systems, and then we've got our sacrifice paddocks. Now, I don't have a big issue with sacrifice paddocks. The point is, if we're going to contain them, or if we're going to feed all of their ration, we might as well have them in a sacrifice paddock that's saving the 10% energy. That's the key point. And in those cases, we could be going hay racks, we could be going troughs, or we could just be feeding on the ground. So that's kind of that side of it. If we look at the restriction feeding side, I really think we've probably only got 2 scenarios. Again, sacrifice paddocks are an option. We can feed on the ground or trail feed, but you've got to ask yourself, for the sake of a single hot wire, do you really want to be feeding in the paddock and having to fight them at the gate? That might be fine if you've got a gate runner, but not everyone does. Or we could actually offer them hay racks. Now, it's hard to restriction feed out of a hay rack unless we're using something like straw, where the fibre content of the feed is what's restricting their intake, which can work really well. So as much as you might laugh at some setups that are just hay racks with straw in them, they're often quite effective and they're minimising the wastage. On the other side of the ledger, we've got a hot wire containment area with ground feeding. And in these cases, we're aiming for 600 millimetre of trough space for a cow, or 300 to 400 for a growing stock. So I hope, it looks really busy there, but hopefully the way we went at it in segments, to me that really defines what our options are for feeding. And depending what our objective is, we kind of end up in a narrowed set of those options. That's what I was trying to get at this morning. So I've just got a heap of photos here. We've got the opportunity to go somewhere, but I have got most of it covered in some photos and videos, so hopefully we see that. So this is obviously just a loop hay feeder or a hay rack in a weaning yard. There's no reason those weaners can't stay there. The issue is you often become space limiting. So that works when you're weaning and you've got batches of calves coming in and going out. It's not so good if we want to feed all the calves for the next 3 to 6 months. Obviously we've got our grain trailers or pellet trailers for feeding on the ground. These are fantastic in sheep systems. We can definitely feed calves pellets on the ground, but the wastage is high, which is where the belt systems often get considered. That's obviously pellets on the ground. Pellets in troughs, again, the issue here is if we're feeding straight pellets or grain into the trough, we've got to try to control how much those animals are eating and try to push them to a roughage intake, which is hard to do. So with the lick feeders, of which there's very many options, we can obviously wind them down to try and make it harder for those animals. They've got to work at it to get the pellets out. This is another option. The advantage of these sort of feeders is that the sheer volume of them, so they can be filled up at much lower intervals. And in some of our client scenarios, the delivery trucks are actually dumping straight into these, so that's reducing labour input. As I said, lambs, a lot easier because we're happy for them to, like if we're feeding for production, we're not trying to limit their intake. There's no way we can run ewes on this sort of system because they'll just simply eat too much. You've got your poly belt type semi-permanent trough spacing. I actually don't, if anybody knows the current pricing, shout out please, I'm out of touch with it. The issue is they typically don't survive past about year 3 and they're not actually that much cheaper than concrete. So most of our clients have ultimately regretted putting them in, but they certainly work well in the short term. The idea being that they're pinned down by posts and then you've got cables either side that they suspend from. At a certain price point, good, but they probably haven't lasted long enough at that price point. You've then got your concrete bunks with a whole array of options as far as containing the animals over the bunk, but you're basically setting up a feedlot. This is highly appropriate in the case of a production ration, as long as you can justify the infrastructure and you think you're going to use it annually. I mean, a setup like this you would want to be using annually to justify it. And you'd want to be feeding for maximal production. I don't think you can justify these setups on any degree of restriction, and you certainly can't justify them for feeding cows. So getting out of people's heads that this is what they need when they're setting up a containment feeding lot, I think helps make them more open to what they can do. A couple of other options I've seen travelling about. These are bunks that you can feed from the outside of it. So this is effectively a weaning yard. You can feed from the outside. They're actually designed so they're big enough you can actually just park bales on there. So if you're feeding hay or silage, high protein hay or silage, you could park it on there. You could trail pellets, you could trail a TMR. They're actually pretty clever. They cost more, depending how much material you've got on farm, they cost more than the concrete bunks is the limitation. Here's another similar one, but again, you've got the advantage of being able to park whole bales on there and the animals basically treat them as a self-feeder. Whilst being contained. And then these are the hot wire setups. So we've got a bit here and then that's basically the end of it. What we're doing is often setting up it's a single post with a single hot wire, often 10 to 15 metre gaps between posts, and the height, a lot of them are set up to, depending on what your feeder height is. So your hustlers are punching out about 900 mil off the ground. A lot of these were setting up at 650 to 700 mil. Once the stocker got respect for hot wires, these work incredibly well. You've got to be accommodating to understand it doesn't need to be super neat in the beginning. Like animals will escape, and once they get used to the feeding setup, they'll settle down. So often some of the clients will throw their hands in the air a bit in the beginning, but things do settle. Now I've got a video on this next slide, which is just describing, so this is another setup locally that's got a hot wire across the bottom of a paddock, and they're just using a hustler feeder with a combination of straw as the gut filler and then some canola silage that was brought out of the paddock and ensiled on farm. So the canola silage, straw, dry cows can absolutely extract enough energy out of straw, and the fibre is self-limiting, which is great. The issue is, depending on the feed test, the straws are often deficient in protein. And so the rumen becomes progressively more and more dysfunctional at its ability to break down the straw and digest it. A couple of ways you can up the protein. You can add urea directly to the straw at an inclusion rate of 0.5 to 1%, which is not commonly done. The other thing you can do is the rumen seems to be able to handle protein at reasonably irregular intervals. So one thing we're often doing is a whole feed, rather than saying, we might do the ration and say, right, oh, you need 20% of a high protein hay for some true protein going in. Rather than doing 20% every day where the animals are going to fight for it and not be evenly distributed, you just do one feed a week of your high protein source that helps. It's not as ideal, but it does ensure, a little bit like the sheep systems, that they're all getting access to it. And so using that true protein source is often a very good option.
Comment on the condition score of those cows?
Yeah, so this was a couple of years ago. I probably can't see them. I'll see if the next video shows a bit better. These cows, so from I keep condition scoring really simple. We do it visually in cattle as opposed to in sheep. Often people get used to getting their hands on them. In cattle, it's a visual score, and you are not fat scoring, you are body condition scoring. So you're trying to incorporate muscle. Now, we're not too worried about the extreme ends of the scale. I simply use exposure of the long ribs and short ribs and tail head as my indicators for body condition scoring. Soon as I can see long ribs, we're a 2 score or less. If I can see short ribs but not long ribs, that's a typical 2.5. And the minute there's any fat accumulation around the tail head, we're pushing a 3 score. So they're my kind of thresholds. I'll just go back here to try and, so if we look at these cows, probably not good enough clarity, Peter, I'm sorry, but these cattle are in good body condition, probably forward to what they need to be. These are young, pregnant females at a very rough level. I can't see any long ribs, and I can't see obvious. Got to also be careful. So you've got the paralumbar, we all call it the hip, but the triangle in front of the hip is called the paralumbar fossa. Remember, these cattle are being fed every 3 days. So day 1, they're eating 100% of what they can eat. Day 2, they're probably eating 70%. Day 3, they're typically eating nothing. And so you've got to be careful when your body condition scoring that you don't see a hollow paralumbar fossa and go, oh, that animal's pushing a 2 score, when in reality that's just representing gut fill. So these animals are on the 3rd day of having been fed, which meant they probably haven't eaten anything for 24 hours because they consumed it all early. And that's one issue with paddock feed is you can't control what that animal eats in the paddock. Like you might put it into the paddock and say, righto, I want you to eat 60 megs, but it's going to fill its gut every day it can. And you might say there's 3 weeks worth of feed, but at the 2-week mark, paddock's done and you feel uncomfortable leaving him in there so that they end up averaging a maintenance ration. So then you move them. The advantage of this containment feeding is you can just provide them what you want them to have in those time intervals. But by recollection, these animals with 3 scores, I think there'll be the odd 2.5, definitely no 2s in there. This next video, I'll just play quickly. It just gives us a bit of context of so some different options. The first photo I showed you was a custom design containment area. This one is just where the bottom 10% of a paddock has been cut off with a hot wire. The trough is over there, that's the trough there. Trees have been deliberately excluded, although you can put tree guards on them. One big issue is ring barking of trees. And so what's happening is 90% of the paddock's being rested and we're using a sacrifice area of that paddock. And these work really effectively. The negative to this system is you still got to cut the feed everywhere. So the system I had previously was designed like a gridlock. So you had one rectangle paddock that was had good water point. There was a central laneway fenced in the middle and then 3 or 4 shoot off pens. And in that one paddock, 1,500 cows were contained and fed 3 times a week. So pretty efficient system. This is the alternative where you're just pinning cattle in paddocks and trying to get the dimension right to control the dust. I'll skip that. Now these are some photos we had at our previous day over at Rennie Lee. So Rennie Lee have done a similar thing here, except they're cattle that were used to running in big mobs and used to electric fences. They've got a nice rectangle paddock. They've cut a laneway up the middle of it, and that's become the feed point. Oh yeah, next photo shows it. So The difference here is they had about 500 cows in one mob and 700 cows in the other mob. So these are reasonably large mobs of cattle, and they were feeding over that wire. Now, those of you that were there that day would remember these cattle were fairly forward in body condition, certainly forward of what they needed to be, and that's a buffer they chose to leave in the system. A lot of us at a cost of what's pushing on a maintenance ration for cows could be pushing sort of 2.5 to 3 cents a meg are going to want to use that body reserve. They were basically providing ad lib straw in bunks, and you can see down here, this was the existing gateway into the paddock, and they've just fenced along either side, allowing ample trough space for those mature cows. And then I can't remember now, but daily or every second day they were trailing silage out of a silage feeder along that hot wire, but the cattle were offered straw all the time. Now they're eating more megajoule. They're probably bang on for protein, but definitely eating more dry matter and energy than they needed to. Key point here, that was the end point. So getting away from thinking we need lots of concrete and steel, that was just a maxi with a support post and then a hot wire strain between them. So the advantage here is that if we can get a large percentage of the cow herd into one paddock, set it up like this, at the end of the day, we're going to be very comfortable to rip that out and resow the paddock. And often, it's amazing what phalaris plants manage to survive this. And remember the amount of nutrient import into that area. The organic matter is huge, so they do tend to respond pretty well. This is another setup with a hot wire you'll see on the next photo. Initially, these were being fed with, this is straw being fed with a hustler. Once a week they're getting a protein source. That was being fed with a hustler, except they're putting out about 20 bales a feed 3 times a week, and it was getting frustrating to continue doing it with a hustler, so they've just ended up dumping them over the fence, which we were a little bit worried how we would go as far as wastage. Certainly at that point, and also the animals being able to get access to it. But again, it's like our sheep equation, they're only being fed 3 times a week, so the opportunity for them to get a gutful, get out of the road and somebody else come up is certainly there. This is that same wire on day 3 after being fed. So you can see they're really polishing up along the wire. Out here where they're standing, there is a bit more wastage, but this would be maybe 2 months into the feeding period. So the wastage is not as bad as you think. Now, when it rains, this becomes a lot less attractive, and that's when we've got to be careful.
Feeding on one side of that hot wire.
Feeding on one side. So the hot wire is creating the exclusion zone to mean we don't have to go through a gate. It's the feed space, but it's also creating some labour efficiency. Yep. In this case, as you can see, there's not a very fancy paddock. This was just used as a sacrifice paddock, and there's another wire down a bit lower that's holding them into that area. But it's just an area they were pretty happy to.
Are they throwing the hay over the
Hay's being delivered over, strings are being cut, and then they're just leaving them there. Just to save time running the hustler. Certainly most of our clients, a lot of our clients started putting the straw through mixers for cows and just can't, it's just too time consuming. It was great because, you know, if the straw was 5%, a lot of the straw is 7 or 8% energy, but only 4 or 5% protein. So we were able just to lace it with a little bit of grain or canola meal or pellets to get that protein up and then just deliver it out. But it's just the time consuming nature of trying to get straw through a mixer. This is weaners on exactly the same setup, just for context. Mob of 400 weaners, hot wire set up at 700 mil off the ground. They're getting a high protein hay. Silage on this place has run out, so they're now getting high protein hay. And the cost per gain of these animals is about $3.80, which relative to current prices is justifiable. Could be done cheaper with a mixer. And so when I modelled it, the difference in price was about half a cent a megajoule, which meant on a mob of 800 weaners, this is the 400 heifers, on a mob of 800 weaners was about an 8 to 10 year payoff by the time you had some infrastructure costs, the bunks and the mixer. So yes, it's more cost effective, but it's actually not as extreme as people think. And if you can get them feeding on the wire, this is one of those scenarios, these weaners had never seen the wire and dozed that a couple of times. And since then, they've really settled into the regime. And the good thing about a single hot wire is it lets go one end and you strain it back up. The big trick was actually letting them feed both sides. where they got accustomed to the power in it and settled down. That's those weaners at the wire. This is the Rennie Lee weaners, exactly the same setup. So they're being fed a high protein hay silage over that wire. Little comment on hay feeders. I find there's a bit of negativity towards these. These are actually my preferred hay feeder, mostly because the negative is when animals get in there, obviously. But the positive is there's very little opportunity to foul any feed around them. So when we look at these over time, there's not much fouling going around the outside. The bale up feeders or any of these elevated ones that don't have a reasonable catchment tray, there's a lot of feed ends up down here and they stand on it while they eat the feed in the rack. And by the time that's empty and they're looking at what's been trod into the ground, they're not so enthusiastic. Plus the major issue of eye contamination with material out of those elevated bales. Silage is often better. This is a bit of an example. You get a lot of hay turning up around these feeders at times. And then this is an example of what not to do. Bit of a free lib access. And then don't mean to throw stones, but here's another system we saw locally. The problem, there's a couple of problems I see here. They're getting a very low palatability feed put out that they're obviously not enjoying, and there's not much being done to mitigate how much they're wasting. The biggest issue is the calves are still on them. So the ability of that animal, at that point, it's deriving less than 10% of its feed or of its energy from mum, and then it's being asked to compete with mum for the other 90% on a low quality feed. So need to pull the weaning trigger and find a way to feed those animals. They're actually in reasonable body condition, ironically. Yeah, as part of a fodder budget to optimise autumn growth, these are very powerful tools. Certainly, if you're a system that is going to avoid feeding at all costs and be based on pasture, of which there's a lot, then the hot wire setups are your option because you can set them up, pack them up. But yeah, couldn't agree more. Like they're a tool. And that's why I want to remove Drought from that first slide. They're a tool for really managing the autumn break, which is typically where the droughts pinch us. So we did a tour of Argentina about, it'd be close to 10 years ago now. And what was amazing over there is pretty well every farm we went to, and we clearly didn't go to every farm in Argentina, but they all had feedlots, all had on-farm feedlots, and their system was to put their heifers in the feedlot, hound them along, AI them all, put a bull out for 3 weeks, take out the pregnant, and pull them out of the feedlot so they didn't get too heavy, and then finish the others. And so they had these really fast turn-off rates based on animals being joined in containment. They were able to control the environment, get good outcomes, and then punt the excess pretty well immediately. And they were also doing a lot of opportunistic feeding. Then once those heifers came out, they'd be putting empty first calves and cows in to try and add a bit of weight to them. So I think once people have got infrastructure and equipment around them, they see these opportunities in how to utilise it better. So I've been asked to put a slide in on stuff ups, and I think water's a big one for me. Too often, a whole lot of effort's been put into creating a setup and they realise they haven't got the water there, or the water quality deteriorates. This is one of the big issues when we fence animals to dams. Containment of large numbers of cattle on dams is not going to last very long, that's for sure. Trees, ring barking damage, that's a key one. This will happen in sacrifice paddocks, but also got to be careful. A lot of containment lots, people trying to incorporate trees for shade, need to invest in some tree guards. Slope towards the feeding wire is probably a key one. I've made this mistake personally. I've been to a lot of clients' places where they've made that mistake. So you want the slope away from your feed point for drainage, but also for feed being pushed through. Yeah, that's about it. It becomes very difficult if you've got feed building up on this side of the wire and then you get a rain event to even get in and do your feeding. So that's a real problem. Hot wire setups where stock have never seen a hot wire. I think that's a classic, as you can imagine. Rain in the long term is fantastic. Short term can be a battle in these containment lots. But the big one for me, like the one that's completely must be avoided, is a lack of a fodder budget. They put in all the effort and the stock go nowhere. I've had a number of scenarios where people ring me up. I mean, this is hard enough. We don't need to put the effort in and get nowhere. That can be very depressing. So it's the fact that it was started without a plan. Had no idea how much they were going to get through, how long it was going to take, etc., etc. transition back onto pasture. I've put hold your nerve here. I'll stay out of talking about it today, but there's some real, it's really important to understand. Well, I've got a slide actually, we'll jump on it quickly. Doing it when they really didn't want to. Sometimes I think people feel pressure to do this. I mean, we've got a livestock price at the moment that really does mean at a commercial level, if you want out, you can get out pretty well. The bit that's risky is the having to get back in. We don't know how long this will be, and we don't know the price of getting back into the stock, but liquidating a portion of the stock is absolutely an option. Inconsistency in feeding, creating some disease is a big one, particularly with those using mixers. The other complaint I often hear, look, we've got the mixer, now we've realised the tractor's not big enough or we don't have enough of them. So that's often a problem. And excessive use of supplements. I mean, and we really miss the point of making sure they've got enough energy and protein and fibre. So too often we get a bit excited about all the other things we should be giving them. And the classic is where people are worried about, I've got a lot of calls that'll have animals rapidly utilising body reserves in a paddock with almost no intake, yet they're worried about all the different things we've got to add to straw if we're going to lock the animals up. I mean, part of it's just giving them some energy and some fibre to deal with. This was my brother who's a bit, I said our personal experience was having the wrong slope on one of the hot wires. My brother who likes creating stuff created this, works really well, so he'll drive along and the tire will push it back through under the wire, so that was handy. Who to let out first, which is kind of my point about delaying when we exit. So there's a few numbers here, but don't be too worried. We've got a 250 kilo weaner doing 0.6 of a kilo a day and a 600 kilo cow on maintenance. The energy requirements are very similar for that job. Cow on maintenance, weaner doing 600 grams. What's the outcome in containment? We're maintaining the cow, calf's doing 0.6. The required intake, and for the purpose of the argument, I've assumed 9 megajoule feed, so it's the same across both animals. Let's just imagine we're doing a mix. The weaner's eating 7 kilos, the cow's eating 8.3. Not very different, which is we knew because of the energy requirement. Problem is, the potential intake in dry matter on pasture, if we let these animals out, this is assuming they eat 100% of what they can eat, because that's what's going to happen the minute we let them out on a green pick. The weaner's intake increases to 8.3 kilos of pasture, and its performance goes up to almost 1.75 kilos. That's assuming really high quality green pick, unlimiting. The cow, she'll now go up to eating 20 kilos of pasture and potentially gain up over 2.5 kilos. So I suppose the key point I want to make is that in containment, the cows are only going to be eating about 18% more than the weaners. But if we let them out and intake is unlimited, that cow will eat 140% more and do a whole heap of weight gain we don't need her to be doing. So often the cows are the last we contain. We're happy to contain and feed weaners. My point is, on the point of the break, certainly if we've got them both contained, it's a really easy decision. My point's actually that if we don't have the cows contained and we have the weaners contained, on the point of that break, it's a good opportunity to swap them over. Use the last of some of our feed, because we can't limit what the cow, we've got to be a really good grazing manager to control this. But to allow our weaners to eat 1.5 kilos more and go and do some significant weight gain, that's not a negative. So hopefully that makes sense. This is just me harping on about, don't get too worried about a lot of supplements. They've actually got, this was a slide out of MLA's, one of their containment feeding. They've got protein as the so everyone understands the concept of a holy bucket. Obviously, if we plug a hole at the top of the bucket, we don't really solve the problem because we've still got leakage out the bottom. So we've got to start with the important things first and work our way up the bucket, not down the bucket. We would put energy absolutely number one. The main thing we're trying to get these animals is energy. Protein is a close second, but you know, if we're not getting those couple of things right, there's really no point getting too excited about a lot of the other things going on. I'm not to say ignore them. I'm just saying let's get the major ones done. Second last slide. What are the things we see go wrong? I sort of already did this, but planning, water supply and effluent's an issue. Effluent in most of our cattle setups is more just the slope to or from the feeding point. And if you knew that hot wire setup was going to be a long-term thing, investing in just a gravel apron to create drainage and have a feeding point is not a bad idea. Animal health, obviously pink eye is a big one. Fly control, our respiratory infections, which I've been seeing a lot of with sheep lately. In a lot of those scenarios, I didn't quite finish that story, but we're running some hot wires just to lock them up to try and get that space allocation more appropriate to see if that will control the dust. It's obviously not going to rewind the respiratories we've got, but we're just trying to learn for next time. If we feed for more than 3 months, then an ADE treatment is indicated, which is basically where a lot of us are at the moment. So remember that they're getting vitamin A and E out of green feed, and they can store about 90 days worth. So once we exceed 3 months on feed, we should consider giving that treatment, which is where we all are. Feeding diseases, bloat, we've spoken about, acidosis, spoken about, shy feeders is a big one. But the biggest one's probably just not feeding the animals what they needed to be able to do the job we wanted them to do. So that's it out of me. A bit of a summary which we've been through. It all comes down to planning, which is the same message as the water. So.